My name is Pieter Serneels. I'm part of the RISE Directorate, and I'm at the University of East Anglia. My 7-year-old son was very excited when I told him that I would be participating in a session on gaming and learning. And I had to explain him that unfortunately he couldn't come along. But fortunately, in his school, they have a software platform where he actually this week is going to learn some of the maths using kind of computer-aided learning. And so that is what this session is about. It's about bringing technology inside the classroom, or should I say better, inside the learning process, because some of it is going on outside the classroom. And so a few years ago, very nice overview paper by Karthik and Paul, Karthik Muralidharan and Paul Glebe, who they took stock what interventions are promising and possibly promising. And computer-aided learning was signaled as one of the family of interventions that has promise, but where we possibly don't know enough. And it's a little bit in line with kind of the spirit of this morning. It's amazing what road we're traveling. So today you see another 4 interventions where we learn on what works. So this is about computer-aided learning, to what extent that support teachers in the delivery, students in learning, and that's very much part of the RISE agenda that we're following. So we've got 4 nice papers. The first one will be by Karthik Muralidharan, revisiting the MindSpark project, but now 18 months, so kind of medium term to see what the effects are. That's in Rajasthan. Then we travel to Punjab, where Sabrin is going to talk about a government-implemented in-class technology combined with training intervention and see what the effects of that are. We travel all the way to Chile to look at another intervention, Conecta Ideas, through the use of software with kind of low-performing in low-performing schools. What that can affect in maths learning, and then we end up in Zambia for the last paper that Barbara will present, an e-reader intervention combined with community engagement to look at the effect on literacy. So I'll hand over to Karthik. The format is the same, 15 minutes per speaker. If you can hold your questions, if your memory is like a mouse, as is mine, just write them down, because we're going to have a rather short Q&A question at the end, and then we can be very focused in that session. Karthik, over to you.
Is this thing on? Yep, perfect. Let me get, not yet. Okay, this is, thanks again. It's always a pleasure to be here, and this has really become the top conference on education in developing countries in the world. So congrats to RISE for doing this. And I love the 15-minute speed dating format, where you kind of get through a lot of really interesting new papers. So this is really hot off the press. We've only gotten the data about a month ago, and so most of you haven't seen anything here. So the background to all of this is we know that the productivity of schooling in developing countries is low. Conversion of enrollment to learning outcomes is low. Conversion of money into learning outcomes is low. And I think if you look at the evidence review, I think the big picture message is that the 2 big pieces are pedagogy and governance. And in particular, one of the big challenges in developing country education is as if you have tens of millions of first-generation learners coming into the schooling system, people who are falling behind and then kind of get left behind for a long time. There's no way to catch up. So in parallel, there's a lot of excitement about technology and education, but the evidence is mixed. So you got studies with positive effects, studies with negative effects, studies with zeros, and the bottom line is that the details really, really matter. Okay. Now, what we had last year was very promising evidence. A paper presented here 2 years ago that just got published 2 months ago. And this was really one of the largest effect sizes we'd seen in almost anything I have been doing in 20 years in developing country education. And this was a personalized edtech software-based instruction in Delhi, but this was delivered after school. It was delivered after school, and the study was done in a small sample. And so we saw that study much more as an efficacy trial, and then in kind of the spirit of trying to scale up things that are effective, what I'm presenting now is a study that's about 20 times larger, right? And about 18 months worth of data embedded in a public education system. Okay, so that's kind of what we're doing. So I'm gonna, so that's good actually. So I'm gonna, in 3 minutes, recap the Delhi results and then kind of talk about how different this particular challenge is and talk a little bit about the operational issues, get to the results, and then there's kind of very interesting and vexing open questions that I wanna leave you with. Okay, so the Delhi study in 5 slides, okay, and this is, again, I consider these pictures among the most important to understand developing country education. So what this picture is showing you is the x-axis is the grade the kids are enrolled in. The y is if they were actually at a curricular appropriate standard, they would be on the blue line. The red line is where they actually are. So the 3 lessons you take from this is that the kids are already about 2.5 grade levels behind in grade 6. That grade keeps increasing, and by the time you're in grade 9, the average learning level is at about 4.5 grade levels behind, okay? But the even more important point in that picture is that each dot represents one kid, okay? So in some ways, the excitement of computer-aided learning for me is, there's the pedagogy side, but as a researcher, this is like what Lant has been dreaming of since 2004 when he wrote his Copenhagen consensus paper, right? Like, I mean, of actually plotting what these profiles look like, and now you have the data that lets you do that because the adaptive testing means that you don't have ceiling and floor effects and you can pin down exactly what level of learning a kid is at. And if you look at this, you'll see that there are kids in an 8th grade classroom that are down at a 2nd grade level, like I mean all the way up to an 8th grade level, and just imagine how hard the job of the teacher is dealing with that kind of variation in the classroom. Okay, so we've talked about absence, we've talked about effort, but at some level it doesn't matter how hard you work, it's kind of almost impossible to deal with that kind of variation. Okay, so what the software is doing, which is particularly effective, is customizing and targeting instruction at the level of the child. And so this is now kind of a snapshot. And again, you know, it's like a kid in a candy store for a researcher because we have millions and millions of observations of every question every day, what the kids are doing, okay, like on the software. And so this is just showing you one day of data where this is the x-axis is the grade level at which you were assessed in the baseline, in the diagnostic test, and then this is the level at which the system is giving you content. So if you're assessed at grade 2, you're getting grade 2, grade 3 content, and it's kind of moving with where you are. So now in a classroom, literally be having your own instruction at your own level, and that's basically with 100 kids, each of you what the system is doing, which we think is why we're getting these stunningly large effects. So you got about a 0.35 standard deviation effect in math, about 0.22 in language. The distribution of the effects are broad-based so that kids at every part of the distribution are gaining about the same amount, which is consistent with the personalization. So it doesn't matter where you start, like the absolute treatment effect of what kids are getting are the same. But from a distributional perspective, what's really cool, I mean, it's both sad and cool, is that what you're also able to look at the business as usual progress in the control schools, okay? And what you see here is that the kids at the bottom third of the distribution make absolutely no progress, even though they're spending all this time in school. And that's because they're so far behind where the instruction is, it doesn't matter what's going on in the class, like I mean that they're not learning anything, okay? So the absolute treatment effect is the same at all parts of the distribution. The relative treatment effect is basically much bigger at the bottom. It's basically infinite, right? So anything divided by 0 is infinite, but you can see how it's a bigger deal for the kids at the bottom of the distribution because they're the ones being left behind by business as usual instruction. Okay, so basically this, in terms of magnitude, these were some of the biggest effects we had seen. We got incredibly excited, and in particular, and I'll come back to this, almost all evidence we have of successful pedagogical interventions come from primary school, where the concepts are really easy. It's can I teach you letters, can I teach you words? I've known almost no evidence of successful interventions in middle school when the content starts getting much more complex, okay? So anyway, bottom line is this was still an efficacy trial, and relative to my other large-scale studies, I used to feel sheepishly apologetic about the sample size of 300 kids, like in the treatment and 300 in the control. I think Orazio then, I think told Abhijeet, this is already, if it's individual randomization, this is bigger than any ECD study we have, and Perry Preschool has more papers than data points, right? And so it's like, so at some point, it's a large enough sample when you have individual randomization. But given that what we care about is affecting systems at scale, what we then kind of worked on is this was much more of an efficacy trial, and a pathway to scale to reach low SES kids would mean you need to find a way to deploy this in public schools. Okay, so the next phase of this project, again supported indirectly by DFID through GIF, through a grant to education initiatives, to work with the government of Rajasthan to do this deployment. So we're now working within government schools, right, like within school schedules, integrating the MindSpark into the timetable of the schools, which I'll talk about, across rural and urban areas, with active participation agreement of school teachers, and much more constraints and availability of hardware on fidelity of implementation, right? So this thing is completely controlled by EI in terms of implementation, and now we're looking at a model that's kind of going into government, implemented by government, okay? So 4 districts in Rajasthan, the other schools, and this is an interesting side story that this whole experiment is possible in the other schools because of the school consolidation. So you have larger schools that have the scale that allow you to build a computer lab, okay? So pairwise randomization, about 6,500 kids, so that's about 20 times the size of the Delhi trial. Okay, so here's the scope. Where's Malik? That includes, I think, his home district. He told me he's from Junjunu. Okay, but that's Churu, Junjunu, and these are tribal districts. So it's covering some of the full diversity of the state. So the schedule, and I'll show you the timetable in a second, but the way this whole thing is implemented is you have a MindSpark lab with about 20 to 25 computers, and then it's integrated in the school timetable so that, say, second grade math, twice or thrice a week, will come into the lab, okay? So you're fully integrated, so each class gets about 1 period per day divided between math and Hindi. You end up with very interesting operations research issues about how do you optimize the number of computers given variation in enrollment across grades. So there's going to be a whole process document that EI is putting together, which is really relevant for any edtech deployment, right? It's not just MindSpark, doesn't matter what the platform is. These are general integration issues that you're going to have to deal with. So we're producing all of that output as part of the project. And one of the innovations here was, even though the initial focus was an individual customized learning, in many classes and schools you had 35 or 40 kids and about 20 to 25 computers. So we did have to pilot and test this 2-to-1 model where kids were paired with a headphone splitter and paired according to initial levels. And that's kind of what we have. And the implementation is carried out by the regular subject teacher who's trained to go with the class into the lab. But what we did have was a kind of a lab in charge who's kind of in charge of the hardware, the logins, and just making sure that the teachers are not kind of freezing, and like, oh my God, the computer just froze, I have no idea what to do. So the lab in charges are relatively inexpensive, but that's the kind of one EI personnel in the picture. So here's what these labs look like. They're pretty well equipped. So that's 2 kids with their splitter headphone. As you can see, that's 1 kid who's got lucky to have her own machine, okay? But you'll see this variation. And here's timetabling, okay? And I'll come back and talk about the challenge that this poses, but here's how you maximize the use of the hardware, right? So you have the MindSpark room and the MindSpark's timetable. So the first period in the day is always the homeroom period, and then after that, different grades and different subjects are kind of rotating in through the lab, okay? So that's how that works. Okay, so now let's get you some results. And the first thing for the first few slides is, the good news is that the results from Delhi for the most part are going to be replicated. Okay, so this is now much more representative, and I genuinely believe this is the most important picture to understand developing country education, okay? Because now you have a more representative sample of 6,500 kids. In Delhi, it was a self-selected sample that came to the after-school program, done across 4 districts, done all the way from grade 1 to grade 8. And what you're seeing is basically that same pattern, that the average rate of progress is roughly half of the syllabus in math, and that spread continues to be as vexing as ever, okay? And I'll come back to why this is such a difficult problem. But where's Lant? नहीं ये आइडिया मैंने लैंड से सीखा था कि अभी इस लेक्चर के बीच में अगर मैं हिंदी में बात करने लगा तो हाथ उठाइए, कितने लोगों को समझ में आ रहा है? लगभग 20% होंगे ना? तो लेकिन अभी तुमको देखो, तुमको समझ में आ रहा है? क्यों नहीं आ रहा है? बेवकूफ लड़की, इसको देखो, इतना होशियार लड़का है, इसके वजह से नहीं पढ़ सकते। तो लेकिन मैं ऐसा क्यों कर रहा हूँ? अभी देखो, मैं क्वालिफाइड प्रोफेसर हूँ, मोटिवेटेड हूँ, फीलिंग से पढ़ा रहा हूँ, ऐसे नहीं कि कभी एब्सेंट हूँ, एक लेक्चर में डबल सिखाऊंगा लेकिन कुछ समझ में नहीं आएगा, तो फायदा क्या है? तो ये मैं इसलिए बता रहा हूँ ताकि आपको 1 मिनट के लिए महसूस हो कि हर दिन बच्चे को स्कूल में क्या महसूस होता है। So the reason I did that was to give you 1 minute in the shoes of a typical kid in a typical classroom in a developing country. And it doesn't matter how qualified I am, how motivated I am, I can show up and teach with passion, but if I'm teaching not at the right level, I might as well be teaching in a different language. Okay? And if you then want to understand why you have dropouts, it's not because parents and kids don't want education. It's like going to school day after day and not understanding anything is a miserable experience. Okay? And the way to understand the Indian education system, you look at this picture, and people look at me and says, wait, I thought you guys had a great education system in India. You have the CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of Google, the Chancellor of UCSD. And I'm like, no, what you have in India is not an education system. What you have is the world's best filtration system. Okay? So if you manage to identify the top 0.01% of a billion-person distribution, you could put those kids in a circus and they would still do fantastic things. Okay? So it's purely selection, 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 as opposed to education. Okay? And it's what a picture like this forces us to confront is the reality that if you've fallen behind, you're basically left behind forever, and hence the centrality of foundational literacy and numeracy is the single most important thing we try to do in trying to build education systems. Okay? So in many ways, more than the RCTs, more than the results, it's the descriptive stuff that comes out of this that I'm almost more excited about, right? I mean, than the treatment effects themselves. Okay, so the good news is that in the in-school model, we see significant positive effects after both. So the year 1 is more like 6 months of exposure, so I'm going to focus on 2 years of results. The good news, again, is that we see similar treatment effects at all grade levels, grade 2 and 3, 4 and 5, 6, 7, 8. You can't reject that those treatment effects are comparable. Now, of course, these are smaller in magnitudes than what we had in Delhi, which is not that surprising, given that that was supplement and this is substitution, okay? That can mean, but the effects are there, the effects are positive, and I'll get done in 2 minutes, okay? And you have the same patterns like of positive kind of first order stochastic dominant results where the treatment kids are doing better at every part of the distribution. And the same pattern again, you see that the absolute effect is comparable, but the kids at the bottom third are kind of learning very little. So all of those patterns that we saw in Delhi are now replicated at 20x the scale in a public schooling system in the state of Rajasthan, okay? The dose response looks remarkably linear, and so that keeps us optimistic that you'll continue seeing effects like amine over time, but we'll only write up the full paper with 3 years of data because that's the duration of the experiment. So let me spend the last 1 minute talking about, okay, cost effectiveness. The Delhi one was expensive, mainly as a function of scale. This one is 4 times cheaper. The hardware cost, so all of this will come down over time, okay? So part of our long-term pathway to scale is we went from 300, you cut the cost by 4x at a scale of 600, 6,000, at a scale of 50,000, that cost falls further, right? So part of the process discovery is also, those are the things you don't see in the RCT, but those are things that we work constantly with the government, with EI, and keep pushing on the margins of which piece can you keep kind of squeezing the costs out of, okay? And in particular, what's exciting about technology is that with many other pedagogy interventions, you can do all the training you want, but you have no visibility of what's going on inside the classroom, okay? Here, I know every day, every kid, every keystroke, right? How much time on task you have, and we can use that to kind of crack both governance and pedagogy, right? Which is kind of what's exciting long-term about this. So what's the bad news? The bad news, okay, so magnitudes, this is fine. I mean, like I said, it's in the range of some of the most effective interventions we've seen in pedagogy and governance, with the big additional bonus that I'm not aware of any study that's seen similar gains in middle school, okay? So all of this is primary, and in middle school, it may be much, much harder. So even though it's same magnitude, my sense is it means a lot more in the middle school, okay? So let me use my last slide, on the challenge. So the bad news is, and I wouldn't say bad news, okay, the big challenge is what makes this so difficult is if you go back to that timetable, you've taken away half, like about 2 to 3 periods a week of the regular instruction that the teacher was doing, okay? And so if you go to a teacher whose entire life is focused on the textbook and completing the curriculum and say that, aha, I'm taking away 2 of your periods or 3 of your periods, now this is completely throwing this teacher out of his or her equilibrium, okay? And we still have no clue on how to fix this problem, okay? Because, when I have 20 lectures for a course, if I lose 1 lecture for a holiday, I'm like already trembling as to how I'm going to make up. And here you're taking away a third of the time that people have to a half. And in the first year, I think teachers were just doing some ad hoc combination of covering less material, same material more quickly, reducing time for revision or exam prep. And so the bad news is, like, I mean, even though we get all of these positive results on our tests, which are constructed to span the whole distribution, when you look at the impacts on the school exams, like, I mean, the results are zero, okay? And if anything, the point estimates are slightly negative, not significant, suggesting that there's a genuine opportunity cost. Like, I mean, you can't take away half the instructional time and not expect to see a cost at some other part of the distribution, okay? So, and our concern here then, and this gets us into really kind of complex territory, right? So at one level, I'm convinced the kids are learning more because we have independent assessment validation of that. But if that learning level is happening way below the grade level, it's not going to show up on the school exam. And the school exams are going to be the filters, like, I mean, that determine whether kids go on to next grades. So there's a risk that doing teaching at the right level could actually hurt mechanically, right? Because if kids are cramming for the test and able to pass, and we're kind of reducing that cramming, that may be bad for the kids in the filtration part of the education system, though we're clearly helping them on the human capital part of the education system. Okay, so the challenge then from a design perspective is how do you mitigate against some of that? So in the second year, EI worked to produce a much more detailed guide for teachers on how to think through all of these issues with a 200-day instruction plan, combining all of this stuff. And these results, we're collecting the admin data on the school test right now, so we should have that in about 2 months. But yeah, so the jury is out, okay? So I don't know what's going to happen. But just to highlight that it's not all roses, like, I mean, this is a real problem. When I have so much variation, what should we be targeting and what should the core outcome be, okay? So I won't even talk through this. I'll just tell you all the future stuff that's coming, and maybe I'll cheat and use the discussion to kind of give you some answers of what we're additionally doing on testing the importance of personalization per se relative to everything else in the content, okay? So let me stop there, sorry.
It's hard to present after lunch, but it's close to impossible to present right after Karthik. But I guess I don't have a choice. Do I have to do something or? Okay, all right. I am Sabrin from University of Delaware, and I will be presenting a technology intervention in the classroom, which will, similar to the MindSpark intervention, be integrated into the classroom, but it will not substitute teacher-led instruction. It will kind of complement the teacher-led instruction. Now we have the Twitter feed, or oh, a technical problem, okay.
You want to start saying a few things about the intervention, and then I'm sure we'll...
Okay, yes, sure. So I guess the slide is not necessary, but the motivation for this study is really that we have seen an increase in, all right, I guess let me do the regular thing. This is joint work with Adrienne, Lucas at University of Delaware, Waqas, and Umer, Saif at IT University. So the motivation, as I was saying, for this study is broadly, I guess this slide is unnecessary for this audience. You all know that education is important. Access has gone up a lot in the last 20 or so years, but enrollment or access does not equal learning. And we see large learning gaps, even conditional on enrollment. So the question that we ask is what are the cost-effective ways to improve learning, specifically in middle school? Again, I guess this is the benefit of speaking after Karthik. You motivated a lot of this. We don't have a lot of evidence beyond primary grades on how to improve learning in developing countries. And so what do we know? This is my slide with the most words, but I still cannot put all the literature on here. What we know is, just giving inputs does not necessarily work. Teacher training and materials does work in most contexts. In terms of technology, computer-assisted learning or personalized computer-assisted learning is very, very effective outside the classroom. During the school day, it's a mixed bag. For it to be effective, technology needs to be integrated with the curriculum and with the teaching. And just by itself, or just by completely substituting out existing resources, it maybe doesn't work. In other cases, technology as a substitute may have worked. For example, satellite lessons in Ghana, but we don't have a lot of examples of technology completely replacing teachers. So this intervention is going to focus on middle schoolers. And the motivation, again, is that there is little evidence that looks beyond foundational literacy and numeracy. The existing work on middle schools have looked at different dimensions of school quality or lengthening the school day. Middle school is especially important, first because we have many cohorts, about 20 years of cohorts of students now entering middle school. These students are mostly first-generation learners. They do not have a lot of support at home. Middle school is complex. You are learning more complex subject matter. The teacher capacity is even more significant here. So teacher training or teachers' own content knowledge is going to matter. And maybe materials need to be more updated as, especially for STEM subjects, some materials can get outdated. Okay. So the big questions that we ask is if technology in the classroom can improve achievement, and we're going to look at math and science in middle schools through a government-implemented program. We're also going to look at costs. So this is the intervention. I'm sorry, I didn't know there would be 9 TVs, so they're cutting through my words. But the first part of the intervention is it focuses on curriculum matter. So the 8th grade math and science curriculum is taken, and that's how the materials are developed. Let me go, I guess this is not in order. The big part of the how this curriculum is incorporated with technology is that online videos are developed for each sort of chapter in the textbook. So this is an example of like a snap of a one point during the video explaining one part of the chapter on science. In addition to that, the teachers receive tablets which have all this content on them, and it's going to be displayed in the classroom where LED TVs are installed. Again, this is because this is not substituting in classroom resources. LED TVs are kind of installed so that they can be used with the regular teaching materials that there are, for example, blackboards or whiteboards. What the teachers are trained, so there's in-service teacher training on first just using technology, so how to open this tablet and how to turn it on, how to go to a video and display it on the LED screen, and secondly, how to use this blended learning in the classroom. It's fairly basic. The training, it's only 2 days, but it focuses on just technology training and more like pedagogy, but very brief in this blended learning approach. So what happens in the classroom is that a teacher would play a video for a few minutes, which is a recorded lecture led by an expert, so potentially someone who has more content knowledge than the teacher himself or herself, and then has access to some assessment questions on her tablet, as well as some simulations that can show the same concepts that she would have otherwise have used a board to show, but can actually display a simulation or an animation in the class. And then this does not take up the entire class time, so once she's done with that, she can do what she would regularly do, just use what the students had learned and do some more exercises and use the board and answer questions. All right, so again, this is unnecessarily, there's been lots of papers about Pakistan, but I guess this is a map of overlaid on the map of the US. And I don't know, my co-author actually saw Karthik put up one of these maps, and we were like, so cool, how do we, we found it cool, and we were like, how do we replicate this? But somehow we ended up on the CIA website, and that's where this is from. So I don't know if you made the map yourself, but you can find it on the CIA website. Don't ask me what we were doing there. But I'm just going to stress that it's the 5th largest country in terms of population, so over 200 million people. And we're going to be looking at the largest province in the country. The country is fairly young, the median age being 23. In the US, the median age is close to 40 or 38. Okay, solve for this line. So what kind of data are we going to look at? So we have, we're going to be not over the entire school year, but part of the school year. The school year starts in April. We go into schools right after the summer break. A baseline is done right after students come back from summer, and the intervention starts after that in October and runs for roughly about 3 months to 4 months, depending on what outcome you look at. So in terms of outcomes, we have independently conducted tests that are going to measure scores on a math test and a science test, because that's what the intervention videos had. And we are also going to be looking at administrative test data. So as part of entering, eighth grade is the end of middle school. Before these students enter into high school, they take a provincially standardized test. So I know Abhijeet does not trust this test. Many of us do not. Manahil totally trusts them. I'm sort of in the middle. I'm going to have both of these tests, but I just want to point out these are, there might be cheating in these tests, or maybe they don't test the skills that we think are important for students, but these determine later life outcomes, at least entry into high school for these students. So to that extent, we do care about how students perform on these tests. Have I gone for 6 minutes, or I have 6 minutes remaining? Okay. That's plenty. Just one slide on what we do. We have endline data. We're going to compare treatment and control students. We have a sample of 60, I didn't mention that, with 30 treatment and 30 control. We're going to look at the intent to treat effects and control for baseline test score and school level controls for precision. So this is the main kind of result of the paper. So the blue kind of bars is a change in the score on this test for math, science, and the two combined for control schools, and the orange one is for treatment schools. So on average, we see that the control school students learn over the course of 3 or 4 months between 0.2 and 0.4 standard deviations. The treatment students learn from between 50% to 100% more than that over the same time period. In terms of the provincially standardized tests, we see very similar effects. So these tests are not just math and science. There's 5 subjects a student takes these tests on. We look at the subjects that were part of the intervention, which is math and science, and the 2 tests combined together. We don't see a negative effect on other scores, so there's no substitution of effort away from other subjects. But we don't see a significant positive effect either. So these effects are also roughly about between 0.2 and 0.3 standard deviations on the provincially standardized exams. Okay, so just in summary, we see large effects on both tests that were independently designed to test students' learnings. And these were, just like we're concerned about how these government tests are, and we are concerned about teaching, the government had those same concerns, and they were actually interested in how students learn on more, I don't want to say critical thinking, but less tests that are less focused on rote-based learning, but more conceptual understanding of the subjects. And so these were designed to measure some of those things. But we see effects on both project-specific tests and provincial exams. We also see passing the provincial test allows you to enter a government high school. So we see a 7% increase in students actually passing these tests and being eligible to enter a government high school. So we don't know yet if they actually do enter a government high school. What are the mechanisms? We were not able to measure a lot of things. We believe, we do see take-up, so we see teachers using it based on the tablet data that we have. We do see it being turned on during class time. We do see higher attendance for both teachers and students. And so we think these are using the technology. So the control, or the status quo is, as we know, low teacher attendance, and even conditional the teacher being there, using only 50% of the time to actually be teaching. So we think this is increasing more what is happening in the classroom in terms of how effective it is in terms of what students learn. All right, lastly, this is the point that I added after yesterday, seeing Dave's. Are you here? Dave Evans? Okay. I guess maybe you're watching on YouTube. If we look at heterogeneous effects by gender, we unfortunately see that these effects are largely driven by boys. Now, when I say boys, I mean really boys' schools. So we have 50-50. These schools are single gender. So we have for 50% male schools and 50% female schools, the effects are driven by male schools. So that could be gender or whatever else is different about schools that are female schools. If you compare male and female schools, you see some differences, not massive differences, but there's selection. So the female students basically do slightly better at baseline. However, we don't think this heterogeneity is entirely because of baseline test score. It's something about female schools where we don't see this. Maybe one of them could be this. So almost all of the videos include a man who is in the role of the subject expert, except one. And she's not that good, unfortunately. So that is to say that it's important to, of course, look at heterogeneity, and some interventions are very effective for both females and males, but we have to think about, when designing interventions, especially the role of female role models to anticipate how those interventions may affect differentially boys and girls. Okay, last, in 33 seconds? No, 52 seconds. That's enough, much more than 33. The fixed costs of this intervention are pretty high. That includes developing these videos, for which a space had to be rented, and audiovisual equipment had to be required or purchased to record. However, once that's developed, the marginal costs tend to be cheap, which includes television screens, tablets, and teacher training. Of course, importance of scaling up. As you increase the number of schools that you take this program to, the costs tend to get smaller and smaller. So at a scale of about 200 schools, so 30 is our scale, the cost of the whole thing is $83 per student, including fixed costs. If you scale that up to 200 schools, it goes down to $20 per student. So this, it's pretty cost effective. It's a cost-effective, very cost-effective technology intervention in the classroom. So I'm out of time, but overall, this kind of contributes to three big literatures. Firstly, just in improving resource constraints in developing country settings, school settings, understanding inputs in the school production function, and understanding government programs to improve education at the middle school levels beyond foundational literacy and numeracy. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. This is joint work with Roberto Araya from Universidad de Chile, Elena Ortiz from the American Bank, and Nicolas who comes from Cornell University. Is it working? No. That's a good start. Now? Okay.
Understood, yeah.
Yes, I think. Is it working now? No? Not yet? Technology, in this presentation about technology always fails. So, thank you guys. Now I have to I will tell you a story. I have it, great. So, I want to acknowledge funding from the International Development Research Center, from the government of Canada, and the IDB also funded this. And I want to start asking you a question. And are you using or have you used a Fitbit? Can you raise your hand, please?
What?
Great. Okay, a lot of people. So what is the point about the Fitbit? A Fitbit, the point is that you want to do more exercise, you want to improve your health, and the Fitbit has three characteristics that are potentially helpful. The first one is that it tracks the steps that you take every day. So then your effort is concrete and visible. Okay? The second feature of the Fitbit is that you're going to receive this congratulation message after you achieve certain number of steps, like 10,000 steps. And the third one, and maybe the most powerful, is that you can use it to do competitions between people and also between groups. And in fact, the IDB, they do that. There's competitions with the Fitbit across groups. And so the point of the Fitbit is that you're trying to make an activity that is boring and that requires a lot of effort in something that is fun, that is exciting. And so that is basically what is gamification. Gamification is the introduction of game elements into non-game context with the idea of making something that is very boring and difficult for you to make it fun, to make it exciting. And typically, these elements are scores, badges, leaderboards. And there is, so, I talk about Fitbit as an example. Again, technology is going to fail. There you go. Okay, so there is a hype about gamification. Fitbit is one example, but there is many, many more examples. And in fact, in the realm of education, we are seeing Khan Academy, they use gamification. Duolingo, they use it for learning languages because you need a lot of effort. And they have more than 50 million users in the US. And if you want to put numbers about this trend, the hype of gamification, you look at Google Trends, you look at searches that people are doing, and what you see is in 2009, almost nobody was searching for gamification in health, gamification in business or in education, but then that took off, and then for gamification in health, it peaked at 2012 and then plateau. For gamification in business, it continued rising and it peaked in 2013, and for gamification in education, continued rising and it plateaued in 2014, and in fact, gamification education won the game among these three concepts, okay? And then it's not only about companies, about people, it's also about papers. So if you look the number of papers published each year that contain the words gamification education, you see again, 2009, non-existent. Last year, there were 10,000 papers that contain those words. Now, can work in education gamification? So we know, we think that it can increase motivation and engagement, and that can sustain practice through play, which is really important. A lot of studies basically practice, and put in effort when it is difficult to do it. So it can work. But there are many people that don't like gamification. Why they don't like it? They don't like it because they think that it can reduce intrinsic motivation. So it can reduce the pleasure inherent of the act of learning. Second, it can lead to anxiety. Because there are a lot of social comparisons here involved. And we know that social comparison increases anxiety in many contexts. It also can happen in an educational context. Okay. And the third one is that there can be novelty effects. You buy the Fitbit, you're studying using a computer, and it's very exciting, but at some point, it's not exciting anymore. It's like the same thing over and over. So there could be some maybe effects that then can disappear later on. So we need basically empirical evidence to tell whether this work or not. And unfortunately, there is very little rigorous empirical research, mostly self-reported data with before and after comparison, samples with 50, 100 students. So at the end, we really don't know much about whether programs that use gamification intensely can produce effects. And then, so why do we care in this conference? We care about this because we know that there are huge learning gaps across countries, within countries, and maybe gamification could be a strategy to try to tackle and reduce these gaps. So to generate some evidence about the effects of a program with gamification, we evaluated one program that is a program Connect Ideas or Connecting Ideas in English in Chile. So this program uses gamification to improve fourth grade math learning. And basically, students go twice a week to the computer lab. They work there 90-minute sessions, so it's within the school time. One of the sessions replaces regular math instruction. The other basically is used in some time that schools can allocate to any subject. And the program uses several gamification strategies I'm going to talk about. I'm going to show the effects after 7 months of implementation. So when kids log into the platform, they will see this dashboard. And the first feature I want to show you here is that they will see the number of completed exercise that they have done per week, the accumulated number. That's the blue line. And this is going to be compared with the class average. So they have this social comparison. Second, the program also has these kind of advertisements that are trying to convey the idea that it's okay. You can look. You should try to compete with others, but also you have to think about yourself. And just thinking that if you try hard, if you put effort, you are going to improve. So here the ad says, effort and only effort. The name of the student, Julian, Karthik. That's the road to perfection. And they have like 10 different ads that are going to be rotating, trying to always push for that idea. Next, all these were individual level incentives. Now there are some group level incentives. So here, this is a ranking of the number of completed exercises, the average number at the classroom level. And this classroom, the one in the middle, is a classroom of this kid that is logging in. So the kid knows where his or her class is, and also what are the 3 schools that are above them in terms of number of completed exercise, and the 3 below. So as the class progresses and they are doing more exercise, they will be climbing in the ranking. And the fourth strategy that the program uses is maybe I think the one most innovative, that it basically involves tournaments that are done every 2 months, where students, they log into the platform, all the treatment students, all the kids using the platform, they log into the platform, and they will be paired across different schools, and they will be playing this game board where basically they have to solve math questions. And if they solve them right, they get points. And at the end, they will average the number of points that they're getting at the school level. And here we are seeing the announcer that is trying to say, okay, this school is first and this is second, but this one is coming. He tries to drive excitement. So the kids really get excited about this. In fact, before starting the session, they start counting down. They start like 10, 9, 8. It's like amazing. It's like, to do math, basically. So the experimental design, this is a within-school classroom randomization with 24 low SES schools in Chile, in Santiago. So let me show you the results. And basically, the test that we use, our main outcome measure, is the national standardized exam that Chile applies. So this is not like the one that Abhijeet was talking about yesterday. This is like a test that has been applied for 20 years. It is administered by a separate entity, completely separate from the Ministry of Education. So there are no conflict of interest. There are reports that show that this is a valid and reliable test. And the beauty of it is that we have data of all the students in the country. So instead of just standardizing with respect to the control group, we standardize at the national level. So the 0 means the average student is going to have test score 0. Everything is relative to the average student in the country. So here what we see, the control schools, in the control section, sorry, this is within schools. So the control section, the kids are lagging behind the average student in the country by 0.6 standard deviation because we targeted these low SES schools. If we move to the treatment group, we see that in language, they are also lagging behind 0.6 standard deviations because we didn't target language. But in math, we see that they're lagging behind only 0.4. So there you see the effect of the program. If you run the regression and also put school fixed effects, so as to soak the variation, reduce the standard errors, you get an effect of 0.22. And if you also control for baseline academic achievement so as to improve precision, now you get our preferred specification of 0.27 standard deviations. And these effects are large if you consider that with this data, we check what is the gap in learning between students whose mother completed secondary education and those who don't. That gap is 0.5 standard deviations. So this program in 7 months cut that learning gap in half. We look at heterogeneous effects. We really don't see much action there. There are not much difference in terms of gender, SES, baseline score. So like it seems that these positive effects are broad. And then remember at the beginning I was talking about some drawbacks. So there could be some drawbacks, and now we are going to take a look at that, not just looking at academic effects, but also non-academic outcomes. And what we see is that these kids improve a lot, but they, in terms of math self-concept, we don't see much. In terms of math intrinsic motivation, what many educators fear that this is going to reduce intrinsic motivation, we don't see that. And in fact, if anything, we have a positive coefficient, but not statistically significant. The third result I think is important. We see this increase in math anxiety, which in some way makes sense with all the literature that we have that social comparisons can increase anxiety. Though the point estimate is not that big, in fact, it's 0.13 standard deviation, kind of close with the other two. Then the fourth one is we ask students whether they prefer the math lessons in the lab compared with the regular classroom. And the treatment kids, 80% of them say that they prefer to do it in the computer lab compared with the control group that is 60% they say that they want to do it in the computer lab. So in some way, the program kind of surprised them. So in general, kids want the computer lab, they want technology, but this program exceeds a little bit the expectations. In terms of growth mindset that we had, there is one specific gamification strategy for that. We see positive effects, but once we control for, basically adjust the standard errors of multiple hypothesis testing, that effect becomes not significant. So we have to take, with care that result. And then finally, in terms of teamwork, this was a big surprise. We measured team effects, basically preference for students where they want to work in teams, and we found a negative effect that was completely contrary to our expectation. And then, we don't have a clear idea exactly how to answer to explain that result. But one potential explanation is that the fact that you experience working in teams, we work in teams, we know that sometimes it's not easy, sometimes you're not happy. So they may have had some expectation, and then it was a little bit worse. So, but we want to know more about that. So to conclude, in the hype of gamification, we present one of the first rigorous evaluations of a program that used intensely this type of a strategy. We find these large math effects. We found these mixed effects in terms of non-academic outcomes that we have to think seriously about. And for us, this like a little bit, I share the excitement of Karthik, of the other presenter, that this is like a really interesting line of research that we have in front of us. And for us, really, it's like a similar issues that they were talking about. We are thinking about, we did this in Chile. This year, we're replicating it in Peru, but we are tweaking the model so as to reduce costs. So in Chile, it increased cost per student by 5%. So I'm trying to reduce that maybe to 3%, something like that. We want to see whether this can, scale up successfully and take out the question mark. And then unpacking, that's a big question. This program is doing many things. Can we do an RCT where we try different things to try to unpack what is really driving the results? And finally, thinking about avoiding these unintended effects. And so if I have to summarize this paper like in one line, I think I would say that gamification education, I see it like as powerful, but handled with care. Thank you so much.
Is my mic working? Can you hear? Okay, so that's working. All right, well, I can at least talk about the first slide, which has the title and my co-authors, all of whom are either current or former colleagues at the, so let me go back, at the Population Council, either in New York or in Lusaka. And one of them, Stephanie Saki, is actually in the audience. So by motivation, I think you're all familiar with this. Zambia actually competes with Malawi and SACMEC for having the worst literacy and numeracy scores. At the same time, between 2000 and 2010, the rate of secondary enrollment in Zambia increased 75 percentage points, according to the World Bank. That's historically unprecedented. Yet, this is DHS data, about a quarter of women aged 20 to 24 in 2013-14 couldn't read in Zambia compared to 11% of men. So here's a case where there is still a gender difference in learning. And a critical factor we think contributing to the low literacy is the absence of books. So Girls Read Zambia. Our primary objective was to improve literacy among grade 7 girls. That's the last grade of primary school in Zambia, attending government schools. We had a set of secondary outcomes as well that I won't be reporting on. And this intervention is done through 3 key activities: e-readers, safe spaces, and community engagement. Here are our districts. Our districts were selected by our donor. This is actually a project funded by DREAMS. It's a PEPFAR project, an HIV prevention program. And so you might wonder, why is an HIV prevention program funding a literacy intervention? It's because of now the research linking education and HIV. And so that's where the funding came from. So these are high HIV districts. So we had no say in the selection of districts. Moreover, when we were trying to identify schools for Girls Read, we wanted to avoid schools where there were other DREAMS activities, but because everybody was working in the same districts, that was not a trivial matter. So, and in choosing schools, the schools that were left over after the other DREAMS activity, we chose those schools with the highest proportion of girls behind grade for age. So we got the schools with the most vulnerable girls, or if you consider vulnerability, where there's the most repetition. So that's our population. So this was a 3-arm RCT, and in terms of Karthik's language, this is a pilot study or an efficacy trial. You might say it's a small study. So Arm 1 was safe spaces, community engagement, and e-readers. Arm 2, safe spaces and community engagement, and we had that because we wanted to see the effect of e-readers over and above the effect of safe spaces and community engagement. Arm 3, control activities. In year 1 when the evaluation was done. In the second year, because of, again, the nature of our donor, we had to implement the full program in all of schools, regardless of what the effect. We didn't know the effect of the intervention, but that was what the donor wanted. We did a baseline in the first quarter of 2017, an end line a year later. We started out with a sample of around 1,300 girls in 36 schools. Our follow-up rate was nearly 91%, and there was not differential attrition by arm. So a little bit about the intervention. Girls received their own e-reader. It was provided by World Reader. World Reader is an NGO founded by a former Amazon exec who had wandered around the world, saw that there wasn't a lot of reading materials, decided the best way to do this is through e-readers. They were e-readers designed for Africa, so they're a bit sturdier than your normal Amazon e-reader. Girls could charge the e-readers at school using locally sourced solar units, which we installed at each school on the roof of the school. But it turns out they charged elsewhere. Charging was not as much of an issue as we initially thought. A lot of these kids have phones anyway. They were, and this is how it differed from other World Reader projects. All other World Reader projects had been either in schools or in libraries. But we wanted these girls to take the e-readers home and keep them over school breaks. And World Reader was a little bit nervous about that, but you'll see that actually worked out. And they were encouraged to read to others, to siblings, parents, friends. The e-books. Each e-reader was loaded with approximately 100 books that we chose. We read a lot of these books. They were primarily fiction. They were in English because English is the language of instruction, starting in grade 5 in Zambia, and also the language of for the primary school leaving exam, but they were all African fiction. And they were at varying levels, from very basic readers, but readers for a content for more adolescent girls. So they weren't your kind of Dick and Jane type stories. And diverse content, including alternative views of gender roles and books we think with strong female leads. Safe spaces, there were 15 to 20 girls per group, 2 groups per school. They were led by female mentors. There was a teacher from the school, but not the teacher of the girls in the group, and also a mentor from the community. They met once per week after school, so while this session is called Inside the Classroom, yes, this was inside the classroom, but it was outside of the school day. So there are 19 two-hour sessions over 6 months, a relatively short intervention. Again, we were constrained by budget and donor. So in the first hour for the Safe Spaces curriculum, both the e-reader arm and the Safe Spaces only arm, they covered a session from the Girls Read Empowerment curriculum. So this was a curriculum that we designed. Now, and I know Dave Evans isn't here, but one might, when he was talking yesterday about how general interventions are more effective, or as opposed to targeted to girls, well, you can imagine if you were going to have a literacy or an e-reader intervention for girls and boys, you wouldn't have the empowerment curriculum in the first hour. You might have 2 hours devoted to literacy. So that's a reason why when you have interventions for girls, particularly for adolescent girls, given the constraints they face in countries like Zambia, you bring in other factors that might dilute the effects, for instance, on your education outcomes. And then there was a community engagement component as well. So one issue that we faced when we first started talking about this, or one thing everyone asked us about is, e-readers in rural Zambia, for instance, it turns out that, so we distributed 425 e-readers to girls in year 1, only 13 were lost. In year 2, when we had to expand this to every school, we distributed over 1,200 and only 33 were lost. It wasn't a problem. And I think one of the reasons it wasn't a problem is that we emphasized that the e-readers can only be used for reading. There's nothing else you could do. You can't play games. You can't surf the internet. So we got our e-readers back. It just was not an issue. Okay, so in terms of our educational outcomes, somebody I think yesterday talked about UWIZO. So we use the UWIZO English and Math assessments. This is a simple English diagnostic of progress in reading foundational skills. It's set at the grade 2 level. Remember, these girls are at grade 7. We had 3 dichotomous outcomes: an increasing level of difficulty. Passing the paragraph is very simple, like a few words that they had to read. The 3 simple sentences each had about 3 words that they had to read. Passing the story was a greater degree of oral fluency that was required, and passing the story questions mean they had to answer questions. It was a reading comprehension component. But because it was pegged at a low level, we also designed a multiple choice assessment, and we took the questions from the grade 3 and 5 textbooks, as well as an old grade 7 composite exam. But that assessment focused on elements that we did not cover at all in the Safe Spaces sessions. It was just grammar, or mostly grammar, and more complex vocabulary. And then for numeracy, also we used UWIZO. We didn't divide it up into those separate outcomes, although we could, and that's because the level of numeracy, this is true elsewhere, was higher than it was for literacy. Also, numeracy was not one of our primary outcomes, and we had a multiple choice exam. And then we also added an assessment of nonverbal reasoning, which was a subset of the Ravens-colored progressive matrices. Some people call it IQ. We actually think it's a measure of nonverbal reasoning, and it is mutable, and you will see that it is. We did an intent to treat analysis. We did not do a difference in difference model because we didn't have the power given the small sample, but we have the baseline score on the right-hand side. So that's, and all models were estimated with robust standard errors clustered at the school level. Now, here are our baseline characteristics. I think there are 2 things to note. One is at the very low level of literacy. Remember, this is pegged at the 2nd grade level. So in terms of reading comprehension across arms, you could see that it ranges between 35 and 41% who could answer 2 simple questions. The other thing to note about this is that it's not balanced entirely, and that the e-reader arm, unfortunately, it had to be the e-reader arm, which has slightly better scores, except for the multiple choice, where the control did better. We would have liked to have seen the control to do better all over, but so we had to deal a little bit with the unbalanced sample, and we used something called entropy balancing, which generates weights so that the safe spaces and control arms are matched on the e-reader arms on specified covariates and outcomes at baseline, and it differs a little bit from propensity score matching, and you can read about it with the references there. So here are our results. These are the 3 UESO and the multiple choice. At the bottom with the percentages are the actual N-line scores for the control group. And what we're doing is comparing to the control. So it's a % difference relative to the control. We did not have a significant effect at the most basic level, but maybe if you're so far behind, nothing, by this point, there's not a lot we can do. But we did have significant effects here for the e-reader arm by comparison to the control. Not true for the multiple choice. As I said, multiple choice was a lot of grammar. Here is the same sets of outcomes, but with the entropy weighting, and you would get this, you draw the same conclusion. And this is true for all of our models. Didn't make that big a difference. It did reduce it slightly, but what was significant in one was significant, and the unweighted was significant in the weighted. So this is just descriptive data, because one of the things we wanted to look at is whether you see an effect where there is greater attendance, knowing that those who attend more are selective. And so you can see that, so we're looking at the difference between baseline and end-line. This is the e-reader arm. This is the blue is the safe spaces arm. You can see with greater attendance, you see more of an effect, not surprisingly. Now, one of the things to note, actually, for both the e-reader arm and the safe spaces arm, is that we had very high level of attendance. And we did not have actually higher level of attendance in the e-reader arm, which is what I might have expected. So the median number of sessions attended for both arms was about 16 out of 19. And one of the things, if you look at 18 to 19 for the e-reader arm, 18 to 19 for the safe spaces arm, they had exactly the same baseline score, and there you can see the difference. So you do see an increase here, but it's a bigger increase here, and that's actually a significant difference. In terms of numeracy, no effect, but where we did have an effect is for our ravens, for our nonverbal reasoning, so a significant effect for the e-reader arm, and we were wondering what's the mechanism there. And it may be that if kids read who otherwise aren't exposed to, a lot of content, that somehow that stimulated the brain, and they did better on the nonverbal reasoning. It also may be that they were manipulating the e-reader, and they learned how to do that, and that may have helped them in terms of the kind of assessment that is being done with the ravens, which is a kind of more of a spatial thing. So about cost, we didn't do a cost-benefit analysis, but we're always asked, saying, well, that might be nice to have e-readers, but aren't they expensive? And it's the same as all of the technology interventions that we're talking about. The fixed costs are high, the marginal costs are very low, because the cost of the e-book is very, very, very cheap. So if you assume an e-reader lasts for 4 years, the cost of 100 books on each device per student per year is about 35 cents per book. And that's because it's our expectation that the e-readers would last for a while, because we didn't have any trouble with them, at least for the 2 years we have used them. And as I said, the thing that's great about the e-readers is compared to tablets or computers, they're single function devices, so they can only be used for reading. World Reader itself is going to a phone-based system for their library. I don't think that's actually the best idea if you're really trying to focus on literacy. For one thing, it's harder to read on the phone. And for the other, the best thing, as I said, is that it was dedicated. So just by way of conclusion, I think that this evaluation of this pilot study demonstrates that exposure to facilitated reading groups and access to books can have the potential to enhance basic literacy and nonverbal reasoning skills. Is it ready for scale-up? Not yet, but we're hoping to, we're certainly exploring opportunities to expand it and position it for scale. We have left all these e-readers in the schools, so we have 1,200 e-readers in the schools. We'd love to go back to see whether they're being used or whether the e-readers are being locked up in some office like textbooks are and they're not getting out. We have no idea, but we're certainly looking for funding because we think it would be worthwhile to see that. The other thing is for our own participants who no longer are exposed to the e-reader, because if they're in school now, they're in 8th grade, would the boost in literacy be maintained? I somehow doubt it. We had a very small, we had a boost, but if you don't have the continuous exposure at these low levels of reading, you're probably not going to be maintaining that. And would e-readers alone produce an effect on literacy without embedding them in a safe spaces platform? We don't know. It's, again, another thing we'd like to see. And would more exposure produce larger effects? This is a very short intervention, yet it still had some of effect. And then would it have a greater effect if implemented earlier than grade 7, which is something the Ministry of General Education in Zambia is very interested in doing, where we define some funding. So that's it. I acknowledge all of our collaborators.
Okay, if I can invite the speakers up front. Yes, you're supposed to. It's very disciplined, so you have no free choice here. It's okay. Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah, good. This is indeed musical chairs. Okay, thanks. So we're gonna try to be pretty focused because time is ticking, and I don't want to run too much into the coffee break. We're gonna have to run a little bit into it, and also I don't want to sacrifice the next session. Research has shown that short questions are more likely to be answered accurately. Right? I just made that up, but I hope it works as a disciplining device. So please be as short as possible, and then I'm going to ask the mirror question on the panel to be as concise as possible. Then we can squeeze in quite a few. So I'm going to start here and take 3 questions. One here, Pamela, and one there. Yeah. Can we bring a mic here? Or why don't you start, Pamela? That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question for Louise. It's actually 2 very quick questions. One is, I thought your point about empowerment was really interesting. So how did you measure empowerment? And was there a larger effect on empowerment when you had the e-reader component there? And the second is, yeah, so you were saying there's an empowerment curriculum that's built into a gender-focused intervention. So how did you measure empowerment, and did the e-reader increase the impact? And then the second is, did the reader give you any ability to tell how much people were actually reading?
So I think this question is for the whole panel, and I'm interested in your thoughts on kind of the short, medium, long-term goals here, because I think that in especially these, low capacity settings, there's like, the results show that this is very effective, right? In some ways, it's like beating the teacher, right? But the goal isn't that, and especially in the Rajasthan case, this is like, quite a significant amount of time that the teachers are giving up to this computer class. Is the long run goal that, as teacher capacity improves, these become less important and less significant, and maybe the goal is kind of the Chile case where you just have 2 hours a week, kids exposed to 2 hours a week of this, and it's like a complement and it's more integrated into the lessons. I mean, I imagine that in the Rajasthan case, like the integration will happen. That seems like a significant challenge, but it seems like something you're working on. So what are your thoughts in terms of like the long-term goals of how this can be used, in these contexts?
Great.
Yeah.
Third question there.
Hi, I'm Heather from ID Insight. Inspired by the technical challenges of the session itself, how important is it to also equip teachers with backup plans and other things? How is that built in or not? Because technology fails and you wouldn't want the teacher to just be standing there with no plan. So I'm curious how that was also built in or not built in, or how you might want to see it built in the future.
Okay, let's take these three and then we'll have another round. Barbara, there was one
Okay,
question
yeah,
to you.
yes, sorry, I didn't get your question initially because of the name. But okay, so it was about the empowerment curriculum and whether it had an effect on, whether we had any effect on those outcomes, is that right?
And whether the e-reader.
If we haven't looked at that extensively. We do have a significant effect on gender role attitudes. If my memory serves me well, though, there was not a difference between the Safe Spaces arm. Those girls were also exposed to that curriculum, as well as the e-reader arm. So I don't think that there was a boost, even though a lot of the content in the books, was supposed to encourage that. But I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure that we had the same significant effect in both arms. Then you also asked about the e-reader, whether we can monitor how much they read. It's funny because that's something we really wanted to look into. No, we could not. However, World Reader has designed a new device where you can monitor the amount of reading on it. So for the next stage, if we get that far, that device would be able to do that, because we really would like to see how much they're reading and whether they're reading at home. You saw some of the photographs that it looks like that they were doing it, but we don't know.
Question on short, medium, and long-term goals. Karthik, this has to do with trade-offs.
Yeah, no, I think so. It's an incredibly hard question, right? So I think the problem we're trying to solve right now is the most important one is just the spread, right? And how on earth do you handle that? And this seems like, and TRL, the models we know for primary, you can still do the grouping and stuff like that. As the content starts getting more complex, it becomes almost impossible to even think that tracking would do that. So I think that's the core problem. Right? So that's the core problem. Now, like I said, the one thing I am excited about this is the additional ability to also have visibility on governance, right? Of what's going on in the classroom, and not just saying, here's the training and I'm done. Now, I think long-term, my view is that, and we haven't even started down this journey in a systematic way, is that you want to go back and break down every function that a teacher does, right? Into the things that are more automatable and the things that are less so. And then use the technology to kind of take out the drudgery, the stuff that can be automated, and pivot teacher time towards doing things like, more social skills, more kind of interpersonal skills, and all of the kind of stuff that the technology cannot teach, so that over time, if you go back to the classic Otter, Murnane, Levy paper on technology as a substitute or complement for labor, the general sense is that when you can completely codify a task, the technology substitutes the person. But when the task requires contextual awareness and judgment, that the technology will amplify the productivity, right? So I don't think we should be thinking about this as either or, but it's going to take a systematic redesign of how the technology then empowers the teacher and frees up the time to do the things that he or she can do. So just in the Rajasthan case itself, it's not like the teacher is quote unquote giving up the class. The teacher is supposed to go with the kids to the lab, to the period, it's not computer class, it's math class in the MindSpark lab, right? So over time, you would expect that the teachers then start using the reports and the data that come from that to then improve how they're teaching in class. I think the really hard problem is that, again, education systems have been built historically to serve three very different functions, right? They've been built to serve a socializing function, they've been built to serve a human capital function, and built to serve a sorting function, right? So, and what you're seeing, the trade-off we're seeing right here is that the MindSpark intervention did significantly better on the human capital function, but to the extent that the sorting function just requires a mechanical passing a test regardless of whether you understand or not, right? That's kind of where the tension is. And, it's an ongoing journey. And we're discovering a lot of these trade-offs as we go ahead. So, yeah.
Thanks. There was a question on backups. And Karthik said earlier, the devil is in the detail, as we know, with these interventions. So, Sabrin, can you enlighten us what your experience has been and how you would answer to this question of what if it fails?
I agree. That's a constraint I face in my classrooms too. Almost every time I have to call the help desk. But so the help desks actually are important. So at least in the A-Learn initiative, there was a help desk which offered technical support, but of course we need teacher training. Most important is to design intervention that don't replace the teacher. I guess this is not, I'm not, yeah. In terms of thinking about the design of these experiments, is not to kind of substitute the teacher, but integrate technology into the classroom and really use it as a supplement to the teacher. And so in cases of failure, the teacher, him or herself, can lead the classroom, which is also the longer term goal to the earlier question, is to integrate technology like we think about it in developed countries where high capacity, high quality teachers can make use of good quality technological tools to improve learning.
Let me just say 30 seconds on that. And that's kind of why the lab in charge was actually really important, right? So I think there was some pushback from the government to say, hey, we can't kind of scale with this external person. But I think the main job of the lab in charge is to just minimize the downtime of the system and make sure that the kids have their login and all of that process is kind of streamlined. So,
Gonna have to take two more questions. One here and one over there.
Hi, next ball from Stellenbosch. The question's for Karthik. Given that this is a very small study, I'm referencing that you did an appendix in one of the papers where you reviewed all the large-scale tech studies that have been done, and it's a very depressing appendix about basically tech doesn't work when you do it at scale. So the question is kind of how this is a very optimistic panel about tech, which is kind of in disagreement with the vast majority of the evidence, right? So just to get your comment on that.
yep.
Nice question. Second one there. Yeah. If you make it short, you can share your question.
Sure. My question is for Karthik also. I'm curious if you measured how students responded to it, if they liked the technology or not. And I ask this because Mariam kind of reminded me of the Kansas program where it was funded by the Mark Zuckerberg Initiative, and there was a whole rebellion around, like, what is this technology? It's just causing headaches and anxiety for kids.
And my question's for Julian. You mentioned with your analogy with Fitbit that gamification is useful for turning mechanical and tedious tasks, making them fun. It strikes me that early years maths might be a time when the content requires repetition, for example, learning times tables, making that automatic for recall. Makes me wonder if gamification might have differential efficacy for different disciplines and different content, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Karthik, if you can
I'll go
respond
to both of those quickly.
Both at once.
So if you look at that evidence review, I think the dimension that we highlight that seems to matter is not so much scale as much as the details of what the intervention are, right? So I think the reason most tech interventions fail is from the government's perspective, they focus still mainly on the hardware, right? So in our earlier, if I had the 90-minute version, I would show you that ed tech policy in India still looks like, photo of the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh saying free laptops, like, the chief minister of Tamil Nadu saying free laptops. The entire national ed tech policy, is fundamentally driven by hardware, right? So calculating how many computers per school. And I think the way you should interpret all that failure is that hardware by itself will give you a big fat zero, right? So I think the reason you're seeing positive effects in everything we've seen today, is that in each of these cases, the technology is integrated with the pedagogy in a meaningful way. So now the question is, can that scale? And that's the journey we're on, right? And the hope is that some of these things can and will scale. So I think that's really the margin. Now, let me throw in like a 30-second, the more you start doing this, you realize how hard it is, right? So it's easy to criticize the government for saying, hey, you're just doing hardware. But now if you make yourself an education secretary and have to think about how you're going to procure the software, then you realize that, you can write an RFP for hardware and get a tender and do an L1. But if I've got 55 vendors of software, each pitching, I don't have RCTs, I don't have evidence, so how on earth as a secretary am I going to procure when I have 50 guys pitching their products, right? So that's a much, much harder problem. And there's some initiative, CSF is doing some stuff in India to kind of curate the landscape of ed tech products, but those are, I think, the practical challenges. because nothing in what we do should be taken as kind of an endorsement of MindSpark over something else. It's just that they deserve the credit for being open to the evaluation, right? There might be other products that are as or less effective, but typically end up not being open, right? So, and the quick answer to Manahil is, in this case, my sense at least is most of the kids are really quite thrilled. Like, there's going to be some schools where they schedule instead of 1 period a day, 2 periods a day. So then we can look at attendance effects, as a function of days on which you're scheduled and not. And that's certainly something on the agenda. But at least from what we've seen so far, we're not seeing any pushback. So.
Julian, can you speak to the same point? Because your intervention is about fun, right? Where the students get frustrated, and then answer the other questions.
Yes. So as I said, the students were really excited about the program itself, and when we measure it, it shows in the measurement. And also in the visits, you could see that it was quite dramatic in a sense to be a math class where they were like clapping and shouting. So it was quite amazing. I didn't put the video here because I think it's too much. Obviously, it is edited. So, but still, to be balanced, you see some kids that kind of suffer a little bit, especially with all this social comparison. They are testing, and maybe they're not doing that good, and the group wants to advance. So there are issues here. I think it's not everything is great. With respect to the question about whether this only applies for certain skills, math skills, very repetitive and mechanic, I think that no. I think that when we look at effects at different areas, we find like kind of effects at different areas of math, and also because kids they see the question and they have a notebook and they have a piece of they have a pen, and so they would solve the question. Sometimes they do a graph, they do something, and then they answer. So it's not like they're just pressing buttons, but still, for that part, it's also effective. So it's good for timetables and all that. Yes. So I wanted to add one point about the monitoring that Karthik mentioned. I think that is really, really nice. It's crucial because we did this in Chile, and it went well, and I think also part because they have a long-standing technology education program, so all the technical part was well done. Then we moved to Peru and tried to do there, and it was like, clearly there were a lot of technical issues that we had to solve, and so there is a learning by doing at the beginning. But the fact that you have the data, that you know each session, how many minutes the kids work, that is unbelievable. Because in the, we have, every 2 weeks we have one meeting, and it's like, okay, how are we doing in the average 10 minutes? That's amazing, because then it's like, oh, this is the problem. Okay, now we're going to go there. So I think that the feedback loop that gives for management is really great.
Thanks very much. So,
Pieter, in closing the session, can I just say one thing? Like it's a cross-cutting thing, which I'm really because again, I want to highlight something about technology, which is it is implicit in Julian's and in the last slide. But the other thing, which is just incredibly exciting about EdTech, right? Is not just about using technology as a tool for pedagogy, but kind of totally moving the frontier of feasibility of pedagogy research, right? So the fact that you can now run micro experiments on an EdTech platform because you have the data, you have the ability to randomize, and you sharply reduce the marginal cost of research, I think is just an incredibly exciting horizon for education research. So we have built a learning lab to do some of the stuff where we kind of looked at just holding varying customization, right? So holding MindSpark, holding content, everything constant. And the only thing we randomized was one class, one control was locked into grade appropriate content, and the other kind of got the customizing, right? And so what you saw there is that customizing really did benefit the bottom quartile. So going back to gamification, right? So all of these are things that people theorize a lot about, but the evidence base is so weak, right? And so this allows you to run high frequency, really rapid, large scale trials. And I think, that should be an entire horizon and priority for EdTech research. So.
Thank you. That's a wonderful note to finish on. And it's kind of, I wanted to endorse that. I wrote down 3 keywords throughout the presentations that kind of support that very much. This is obviously a really exciting field, but we're only at the start of what is possible. And so both the opportunities and the challenges are kind of being identified. I think we're at the stage of generating hypotheses rather than testing, actually, if you take a bigger picture. So trade-offs are important, clearly, But there are possible creative answers. Moving out of the classroom, for instance, can be an illustration. A second thing is fun. It's totally underexploited, and you can make learning fun. And this may address some of the things that Karthik raises, dropout rates and feeling like being spoken to in a foreign language, right? And the third thing is the data issue, right? We have then, this is a tremendous opportunity to have microdata to actually understand some of the things that are going on in the classroom or in the learning process. And I think that opens tremendously exciting opportunities. So thanks very much. I hope this is a starting point to ask more questions to the speakers. But we're going to move to tea now, or coffee as they call it here in the US. And that's going to be, I'm afraid to say, 15 minutes break. So we have to be back. We try to stay on schedule at 3:30 on the dot. Thanks very much.